all for committing your time to this discussion. It's really great. We have such a wonderful group of folks here on the task force. I think I mentioned at our last meeting that we were getting ready to do a briefing to the Joint Standing Committee on Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry about the work of the Maine Climate Council and also the work that we're doing continuously as a state and particularly within our department, DACF, to implement some of the strategies that are in the climate action plan. And so I had an opportunity to talk with them and fill them in on this effort here. And I think the whole presentation was really well received, and I look forward to an opportunity in the future once we're further along to go back and maybe give them a briefing on where things are going. So again, just thanks for being here, and I look forward to a good discussion today.
Thank you. All right, well, in the spirit of keeping to our working agreements of starting meetings on time, I think we are going to move ahead. I think we're still waiting on Pat Strauch, Alec Giffen, Mark Berry, and Tom Abello. Barry Brucela let me know ahead of time that she is unable to be here today. This is the one meeting that she'll miss. She's going to be in the field this morning doing a tour of her woodlot, and a number of folks from DACF are with her as well.
Jody, I do see Mark Berry, just so that you know.
Oh, good. Perfect. Hi, Mark.
Good morning.
Anybody seeing Patrick, Alec, or Tom? Did I miss?
One of the things we'll sort of to think about going forward is how you see and other mapping.
Okay. So we're going to ask that folks put themselves on mute if you're not on the task force yourself. If you're not on the task force, we're going to disengage your video for now, and that's just to give us a chance to have task force members see one another more easily. And so we will we'll make you disappear, but we're aware that you're here, and there will be an opportunity for public comment later in the agenda. Couple of just reminders. Wanted to go over the ground rules at the start of each meeting, and that is that we'll be starting and ending meetings on time. We're all coming prepared, having read all of the materials in advance. We're staying present and engaged to make as much progress during these 2 hours as possible. We're striving for equal airtime to enable everyone to participate fully. And listening with curiosity and an openness to learning and understanding, particularly, things that we disagree with for whatever reason. Adopting a creative problem-solving orientation so that by September 1st, we have a really thoughtful product to present to the governor. And committing to working toward consensus, really airing things that we disagree with so that we can talk them out and see if we can come up with a consensus recommendation. Reminder that meetings and materials are all open and available to the public. There is a dedicated web page on the Maine Climate Council's website. All past meeting materials from past meetings are there, and there's also a list of dates of future meetings. All comments are on the record, and just to have a sense of humor, it's definitely okay to laugh at a serious topic. So welcome, Tom Abello. I wanted to give you the opportunity to make any opening comments that you'd like, if you'd like.
Thanks, Jody. I am all set.
Okay, great. So we've got Tom, and while I was reading, did we pick up Patrick or Alec? Okay.
No, I don't believe so.
Sorry?
No, I don't believe we have.
Okay. All right, so great. So just a quick review of the agenda, and then we'll dig right into presentations with Tom Doak and Ryan Robichaux. We're going to hear from both of them on essentially landowner feedback on forest management interests and barriers. You'll recall that in your meeting materials as well was a link to some data that Adam Dagnow and his students consolidated on forest carbon projects that are completed in Maine. And so we'll give him a brief opportunity to just summarize that work a little bit for you. Give you all an opportunity to ask questions or make comments about those three presentations. And then really the bulk of this meeting is to think about what are you taking away from those presentations and from the meeting materials to think about what landowners want, what they may be interested in doing or capable of doing. And essentially, these are the building blocks from this meeting, the next two meetings to give you those essential pieces of information that will help you to form the concept of a program. So most of this is open discussion. We'll be referring to the tables in your meeting packet as well as the information from Maine Audubon, and then we'll move to public comment. Finally, we'll take a look again, as we will at every meeting, at the executive order and see where we're able to make progress and where we sort of chart next steps for the next meeting. People that you'd like to hear from and information that you think would be useful to insert at this point. So that's it. Questions about the agenda, anything that you were hoping would be on here that isn't? Okay. All right, then let's turn it over to Tom Doak, and Tom Gordon will pull up Tom's slide deck and advance those slides as you wish, Tom Doak.
Tom, it looks like you're speaking, but I think you're muted.
There, thank you. I am muted. Tom, I think you just started as a slideshow, I think. Right? Anyway, so I put together this information. Some of this information is in the packet that you already received, but I pulled out from that information some of the key pieces. There's also a lot more other tables that are behind that you did not get in the packet. But what I'm going to talk about are based on three things. This is U.S. Forest Service data about Maine woodland owners. There've been multiple surveys of family woodland owners in Maine. Some research on social science research on woodland owners in Maine and other places. And also just kind of my own experiences with 15 plus years in this organization, plus my other jobs of my interactions with landowners. The interesting thing I think about some of this data is that Maine woodland owners are not a lot different than a lot of the other places in the country. There are some regional differences, but there are a lot of very similar type interests, barriers, and concerns that are shared across the United States by family woodland owners. So a lot of this information actually kind of relates to other places in the state, in the country. So go ahead, Tom. So just a little bit of background. There's 86,000 landowners of 10 acres or more. So there's a whole bunch of them, obviously. 30% of them, they own about 30% of the forested land in Maine. It's an old population. 60% of the land is owned by people 65 years and older. So there's a lot of land changing hands right now for a lot of different reasons. But there's just a lot of new type owners coming, and we're kind of just in the cusp of that. And I would say the next 10 to probably 15 years, you'll see a very significant turnover of land. The flip side of that is there are very few, a very small amount of land owned by people 45 years and younger. Land tends to be either inherited or purchased by people once they have some other means. So you see that it's quite a difference in age structure here, and one of the challenges of dealing with landowners, because what we have now is almost two different generations here, or we'll have soon 2 different generations with different sets of needs going forward. So there's 86,000 landowners, but 77% of that acreage is owned by people that have 50 acres or more. So we'll talk, I've got a slide to talk a little bit more about that. But if you're talking about impact, if you're looking at people with 50 acres or more, you're talking about almost you're talking about 3/4 of the acres owned by those landowners. So something to keep in mind if we're going to develop something, it needs to work for people with 50 acres or more. The majority have purchased their land. But that includes purchasing it from relatives. So they've got some skin in the game. The average size is 62.5. About a third of these owners have 2 or more parcels. So now you're talking about a little bit more complication too, if you're talking about a program. So now we're talking about potentially multiple parcels owned by folks. And one of the other interesting things, I think it says 27% of them have a management plan. Now, that can be, a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And one of the things I would say on these percentages and things, people don't always do what they say they're going to do. Obviously, there are a lot of people say I'm going to do this, and you have to track what they actually did. But 27% or so have a plan, so 3/4 don't. But those that do have done something, have at least done part of that plan. So there's a direct connection between those that have some kind of strategy plan. This is a written document of some kind, and action. So something to keep in mind, I think, is a written document leads to action, and that's something that's going to be important going forward. So Tom, go ahead. So why do landowners own land, and what's really important to them? What are the kind of reasons that they have said they own land? And I put it in order of, these are people that said it was either very important or important. You can see wildlife habitat, I'm sure Ryan's going to talk about it, right at the top of the list. That has been consistent, and that is very common across this country. Wildlife habitat kicks in right at the top. The next 3, as you can see, beauty and scenery, nature protection, and privacy kind of almost relate to each other, and they're very, very much in common. Look down through the list, and you'll see timber products at the bottom. That doesn't mean that people don't care about it and won't manage their land, and because that's not the case in Maine, because otherwise we'd have a whole lot of old growth forest, and we don't. But they don't rank that highly, anywhere near as highly as a lot of all these others. You can see even firewood is much higher than timber products, and timber products meaning something that's produced for the commercial market. So you get a sense, and these numbers have been consistent over a long period of time. And now again, this is the whole 86,000 people. There are different. We'll talk about segmentation. There are different interests among different landowners, but this gives you a sense on if you're going to talk to people and lead into discussions about how to interest them in activities, you should understand that, and the traditional way to reach landowners has been through talking about timber. You can see that's probably not the way for a lot of these landowners to be reached, to be contacted. Start with something else and lead to the timber side afterwards. Go ahead, Tom. So what are the greatest concerns that these landowners have? Right at the very top is property taxes and keeping land intact. And I think those are related. It's the keeping land intact is partly the pressure on trying to keep the land in whole, and often that is an economic issue. So those 2, I think, are the big ones: the property taxes and keeping land intact. You can see the next 2 are public use issues. People using their land. We have a permissive trespass law situation in Maine, essentially, and people can go on your land without your permission, as long as unless you tell them otherwise. So you see that those issues come up for landowners who are dealing with people using their land. And then you can see down through climate change. Now, this is data that's from a couple of years ago. So I'm guessing the climate change could be a little bit higher than it is, because the data is a couple of years old, 2 or 3 years old. But climate change, this is the first time, as far as I know, that this survey was that people were asked about climate change, and they did identify it as a issue. So it shows you they're thinking about it. And we've had meetings where we've talked about climate change, and I can tell you that there are a lot of landowners really interested in this issue. And I think the data is going to show that there clearly is an interest here. Go ahead, Tom. So, and again, I took all this. This is some of the. This is a summary of some of the data you received. So, landowners were asked, what are the topics they care about? What do they want to know more about? What methods do you want to receive your information? And what programs or policy assistance would be most helpful to you? Interesting, timber management showed up as the first. So, even though they're not listing it as a high priority, there's an interest there. Or there are lack of knowledge that they want to know more. So the top 3 were timber management, wildlife, and insect and diseases. When you ask them how they want to receive information, their first priority was written material. But then it comes down to talking to an expert, and you can see the flow here of how they want to receive information. And then, what policy assistance would be the most helpful? Again, we're down to tax policies. And again, that's about affordability of keeping land. Strong timber markets were interesting because, again, they didn't list it as high priority for timber of owning land, but they clearly have a concern there. And then cost share practices. Okay, Tom? So I took out of the data 4 different topics that I thought might relate to what we're working on carbon, and these 4 type of topics that I thought might have some relevance directly to some of the work that we're going to be doing. So, and it was asking people, what do you know? How familiar are you with these topics? And green certification, third-party certification. Most of the carbon projects, I think, require green certification, third-party certification. You can see there's a very low familiarity with green certification. Property tax programs, this would be tree growth or open space. It's a little bit more, but there's still, so there's a little bit more there for folks. But if one of the things we're talking about is looking at the open space law, tree growth always comes up. You can see that there's more familiarity there, but still a lot of people that aren't sure. Cost share programs, if we're gonna have incentives and actually have activities that count, you can see that very few people understand cost share programs. So there's an opportunity there. And then asking them what do they know about carbon sequestration? Not a surprise. You could see 84% of them say they don't know anything about it. That doesn't mean they don't want to know anything about it, but they just don't know. They just don't know. So it's something to keep in mind. There's a lot of work to be done if we're going to use any of these 4 topics in anything that we do. Okay, Tom. Jody, how am I doing on time?
You're fine. You're good.
Okay, so there's some social science work that's been done, and you haven't seen this information, but there's some social science. And so, as I mentioned, not all landowners are the same. It's a pretty broad group of folks, and I'm talking about people that own 1,000, typically up to maybe 5,000, but most of them are in a 10 to 250 acre. That's where most landowners fall. So there's been some segmentation work done, and 4 different types of owners emerge. And you can see, these are the numbers for Maine. And the woodland retreat owners, they're primarily interested in conservation, recreation of value, beauty, and that's about 48% of the landowners, family wood landowners in Maine. So by far the biggest group are called woodland retreat. The interesting thing about this segmentation, and I don't have that up on the slide, but there are some data that goes behind this with specific barriers and what you would need to do to reach each of these types of groups. So there's some really valuable things to look at and how to talk to these folks. The working the land people, again, 19%. They value the recreational benefits and use it, but they also see it as a financial asset here. And so they're 19%. The supplemental income people, they're looking at it as a resource, a financial resource. Their land is a financial resource. And then the uninvolved people are people that just not engaged in any way. They don't have a particular interest right now. Doesn't mean they won't, but they don't have a particular interest. As I said, they're the most likely to sell their land, or they may be holding it to figure out what to do with it. But that gives you a breakdown of the different types, the 4 broad groups of family woodland owners and how they're represented in the state of Maine. So Tom, go ahead. I get a little more detail here. So I put this together to just give you an idea of, so that I said there's 86,000 landowners that own 10 acres or more. That's that left-hand column, it adds up to 86,000. 41,000 of them are woodland retreat owners. But if you follow across the page, 11,000 of those, 11,200 of them own 50 acres or more. And of the 41,000 plus, just under 4,000 have ever had a harvest during their ownership. And that's how this chart works. So if you look at working the land people, for example, the 16,340 of those, but almost, not quite 2/3 of them own 50 acres or more. So they're the bigger owners, and they're pretty active in their management. And you can see the supplemental income people a little bit lower than the working, and then the uninvolved, you can see the data on the uninvolved. So it gives you an idea that there's this huge number of owners, but that 50-acre number shows you the breakdown of, the woodland retreat and the working land people are almost the same as far as acreage and 50 acres or more. So something to keep in mind if we're going to be more sufficiently reaching acres. If acres is the measure, then the focus is, because we're not going to reach 86,000 people. I hope this chart is clear. I'm happy to answer questions afterward if you want. Go ahead, Tom. So I did a little bit more work on this to just give you an idea. So as I said, 77% of the land is owned by family owners, by the 32,000 people that own 50 acres or more. And so when I actually went out and when I actually redid the numbers and said, there's 48% of the landowners are of the acres is owned by woodland retreat owners, but 35% 50 acres or more. And so you can see there's an awful lot of very small woodland retreat owners, but the working the land people influence goes up significantly in this chart to show you that those people are owning many of the larger tracts, and the same with the supplemental income people. And the uninvolved people, again, would show that their acreage influence is less in the state of Maine. So there's some key pieces here about how you would reach different owners and how you most efficiently reach a high number of acres. Go ahead, Tom. So I think this is one of the most important slides, and I've got this is my last slide, then I have a kind of some takeaways. So landowners were asked if they wanted to keep their land as woodland. 89% of those people, representing 92% of the acres, strongly agree that they want to keep their land as wooded land. So we're starting from a very high place in the state as far as landowners interested in keeping their land as wooded land. And if we're talking about, sequestering carbon, we're talking about the first principle is keep it as forested land. So we start from a very high opportunity here of how people wanting to do this. Now, can we help them do that? there's a very strong emotional tie to their land. They have a very strong emotional tie. You can see 3/4 of them say they have that very strong, or they agree or strongly agree that they have a very strong emotional tie. And even a majority of them think about, yeah, my land, and I understand I'm providing, and I'm fine with that, and I like the idea of providing community benefits. So I think all these three things show that there's real opportunity here to help these landowners keep their land as forested land. So my takeaways are, I have a few takeaways, and I probably should have put this in the slide, but I sent it off before I finished this. But my takeaways from the data are, written plans work because they help landowners engage, and that will give them some guidance. If you're going to keep land as forested land, most of them want to keep the land as forested land. And one of the big challenges we're going to have is, what can we do to encourage that through incentives, assistance, any kind of encouragement that does that, because people are already predisposed. The biggest concern the landowners have about the costs and property taxes, which is something I think we can address. And if you want to deal with the significant acres, you're going to want to make sure whatever works for landowners 50 acres and more. Patty Cormier sent me a couple of notes, and I wanted to just highlight a couple of things that she wanted to make sure that I mentioned. That really part of it is developing a hook for a lot of these landowners, and you can see that it's consistent with the idea that whether it's the birds, forestry for the birds, or that hook works, but also climate has the potential to be another hook. Get people that are interested in climate and management, and then start with the climate and then talk about how management can enhance that. That's a hook that can work. The other thing that's very clear through the social science is, and she mentions it, that we need to make sure the messaging and the words that professionals have used are not necessarily the words that landowners are looking for and understand. And so, working your woodlot may not be the best way to lead out with somebody. It may be thinning for health or work on the climate. She relates a story about, she gets out of her truck and when she was a field forester, and people would say, if you're going to talk about me cutting trees, you can get back in the truck because I'm not ready for that. And then the other thing is this new generation of owners, plus with the pandemic, so much land is being bought by new owners. There's a whole caveat of a whole class of new owners coming on that are going to have very different needs, and something we're going to have to address. With that, I'll stop. I don't know how I am doing time, but I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Tom. Why don't we hold questions for now and turn to Ryan, hear his presentation, and then we'll open it up for comments to both of them. So go ahead, Ryan, if you want to share your screen.
Thanks, Jody and Tom. Let me know if when I share my screen that whether or not you can see my presentation and hear me adequately.
Great.
How's that look?
Perfect.
Okay, hi folks. My name is Ryan Robichaux. I'm the Wildlife Management Section Supervisor for Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And I put together some information describing the technical assistance that the department provides to private landowners, and some of the lessons or understandings that we have found in terms of those interactions. What are people looking for? What species or habitats are they interested in managing for? And also, I think it would be valuable to touch on how we're communicating that information to those landowners. So the department provides technical assistance to private landowners through 4 mechanisms, and I'll touch on each of these through the course of the presentation. The first is our regional fisheries and wildlife biologist. The second is forest management plan and our NRCS project reviews, which we work with the Maine Natural Areas Program to provide information relative to those plans. And we also provide direct land manager outreach efforts to help inform loggers and foresters and land management professionals about some of these practices that might be employed in their efforts. The final outreach effort I'll touch on is a reinvigorated and a re-emphasized effort within beginning with wildlife habitat to directly create outreach opportunities to private landowners to help achieve some goals that I'll talk about here later on in the slideshow. So our regional wildlife biologists throughout the 7 regions we have in the state provide technical assistance in response to requests from landowners, land managers, non-governmental organizations, and other entities that reach out to us. Sometimes that might include federal agencies as well. Typically, we're providing information in regards to management recommendations based on the landowner objectives or the inquiries we receive. And we also very much rely on our partners in efforts to disseminate and work with landowners in terms of what they're trying to achieve on their property. Typically, that's working in conjunction with the Maine Forest Service district foresters and a relatively new landowner outreach biologist that we have on contract within our agency. I would point out that, you know, this function of the agency in terms of our regional staff coordinating technical assistance to private landowners is somewhat limited based on the work program that we have. And I'll talk later in the slide about how we're trying to increase that capacity to provide more assistance. And the reason I bring up capacity is that typically this has been more of a reactionary approach to folks reaching out to the agency and not a very proactive approach in regards to, you know, a direct outreach effort to landowners, whether they might be interested or historically manage their properties or not. So in a typical year, we address 80 to 100 inquiries from private landowners, NGOs, and other entities. And most of those inquiries are related to timber harvesting, specifically relative to the regional technical assistance efforts. Those do tend to be heavy towards game species management. One of the habitats that people do have interest in to reach out and talk more specifically about with the agency is deer wintering area habitat, which is, if folks aren't familiar with that, it's generally closed canopy softwood stands that allow deer to persist through the winter months and save energy in regards to those stand conditions. But a lot of folks are interested in summer range management as well, which ties into a whole host of wildlife species management practices that meet a lot of needs for a lot of different species. Some of that is tied back into the forest bird interests that are relative to landowners in the Forestry for Maine Birds program that Maine Audubon has and other conservation partners. And again, game species is typically more the more typical requests that we receive through our regional wildlife staff, including turkey, grouse, and other species that they're trying to attract to their property. We also work with quite a few landowners in terms of water level management. A lot of that is relative to beaver and potential impacts to their infrastructure or forest land. There are a component of landowners that inquire about how can they improve habitat conditions for aquatic species like beaver, and we have opportunities to work with them on installing water level devices and management regimes adjacent to these beaver flowages to provide those habitat conditions. More and more, we're seeing requests about information for herbaceous seeding, mainly food plots at this point, but there is, as folks probably are aware, an increased interest in pollinator habitat and concurrently some funding sources that in resources available for landowners to incorporate that into their management. And then we do field a lot of inquiries on grassland management, mainly geared towards grassland nesting birds and what people can do to augment those habitat conditions. Typically, the landowners that we interact with out of the regional wildlife program is between 40 and 100 acres, which is within the ownership acreage that the task force is considering here. I would also point out off to the side that we have landowner cooperative agreements on deer wintering areas, mainly in northern Maine and mainly with commercial forest landowners, probably not supremely relevant to the task force here. We have an MOU with the Maine Natural Areas Program to, as they review Maine tree growth tax law, forest management plans, and other plans that are submitted to them for review. We provide information to the landowner or the land manager relative to endangered, threatened, or special concern species, including forest management recommendations that they might consider implementing or incorporating into their management plan. One of the benefits of this avenue is it provides an opportunity for inquiries or requests for additional input and feedback on the management plan. So those cursory reviews and providing information to foresters and landowners does, in some instances, create that dialogue between agencies, our agency staff, and those landowners to get more specific details or to further assist how they might incorporate those into their management. Mentioned before that most of these are forest management plan reviews associated with the tree growth tax law. Natural Areas has put together this recap of the review efforts that are conducted through their shop annually. It averages out over the course of the 7 years here. We have about 650 reviews per year. And to the right here, this touches on some of the species and habitats that are picked up in that review and are provided information relative to these habitat conditions. You can see brook trout habitat was picked up in 67% of the forest management plan reviews, 18% deer wintering area, 17% inland waterfowl and wading bird habitat, and 11% endangered, threatened, or special concern species. The rest of the categories are relatively minor in few in number in percentages of those reviews. We also provide outreach to direct land managers. We conduct annual certified logging professional trainings to loggers, the folks actually conducting the work in the woods, to provide a wildlife component to their training so that they understand some things that they may incorporate in terms of their harvesting activities that would be beneficial to wildlife species and habitats. We also conduct relatively few, 1 or 2 field tours a year on our state-owned wildlife management areas, where we work with professional organizations and landowners in the general public to showcase wildlife habitat management. What does it mean when we talk about managing for particular species or particular habitats, so that they can see these being implemented on the landscape? I mentioned before the final category I'll talk about here is beginning with habitat, and if folks aren't aware about what that program is, it's a collaborative partnership between the public, NGOs, and landowner representatives working with our agency to maintain healthy populations of all native fish and wildlife through non-regulatory voluntary habitat conservation and management. So we've identified in our state wildlife action plan a whole host of action items that are geared towards creating that opportunity to prevent species from becoming endangered or threatened, which in a lot of instances creates regulatory obligations and can challenge land management activities. So this was an effort that we worked with, and Tom Doak was a staunch advocate of creating capacity to provide a proactive approach to landowner outreach and engagement. And we've worked to build capacity in that regard, starting so relatively small. We did work out the ability to bring on a contractual private lands wildlife biologist. Joseph Roy assumed that capacity last year, and he started right away with trying to create or reaffirm what we understand landowners are looking for information and what's going to be the best approach to get it to them. He put together I'd say an informal survey of forest landowners in Maine, working with the woodland owners of Maine and the district foresters to disseminate the survey information. This was the breakdown in terms of the 85 responses that were received in that survey, and you can see the bulk of those, over 80% were in the 10 to 500 acre range. And some of the responses we got back to that survey helped guide what avenues we're providing technical assistance to landowners for. And I've highlighted on the right side of the screen here some of the higher ranking needs that landowners thought would be helpful or very helpful to achieve their objectives and their interest. You can see that over 70% indicated that written guides to habitat management and also documentation of the resources and agencies that might be available to provide additional information would be helpful or very helpful. Over 60% of those responses indicated that maps showing the sensitive and priority wildlife fisheries and habitats in their area of interest would be helpful to them. And interestingly enough, information on invasive plants and forest pest species ranked highest in terms of helpful or very helpful information for landowners, ranking over 70%. So some interesting information came back from that rather small sample size, which was good because we've recently gone through some efforts to update our Beginning with Habitat program and how we disseminate information to landowners. Typically, the Beginning with Habitat program for quite a while had been focused on town planning efforts and how to provide information to towns so that they can use them in their comprehensive plans and consider more from the development standpoint, what kind of things can we be providing to help towns preserve and enhance wildlife habitat across the landscape. So touching on the survey slide before, we did enhance our mapping platform and portal to make it easier for people to access information on their own and understand what important habitats or species might be present or adjacent to or within their geographic area of interest. We also updated our website to include additional information on technical assistance, financial assistance that might be available, and habitat management guides. So hitting on the first category in the survey responses, the information that's been indicated would be helpful for landowners to have access to provide additional resources to help them manage their property. So Joe's efforts, like I mentioned, is really focused on proactive engagement with landowners to help achieve, in the end, relative to his position, enhancements or habitat management objectives that are outlined in our state wildlife action plan relative to those species of greatest conservation needs. So it is very much focused on engaging landowners to help craft what they might want to do and help steer them in the direction to achieve their objectives. Joe provided this slide here where it talks about when he's interacting with landowners, what is it that they're interested in? And I don't know, I haven't spoken with him directly, that if when he calls or shows up that he has a Fish and Wildlife Agency patch on his shoulder, does that skew kind of his perception in terms of what their interest might be? I don't think that's the case given Tom's description of what is it that landowners are interested in managing for. So he's indicated that wildlife habitat is really one of the standard inquiries that he either gets contacted by other conservation partners or landowners directly. The other component of their interest has been healthy forest and environments, general forest health and how to provide and maintain a healthy forest on their ownership and property. Legacy planning, which was another thing that Tom picked up on, was very important to folks. And technical advice and financial assistance. Those are things that rank strongly in terms of Joe's interaction with private landowners. In his brief time with the department under contract, he's created over 90 total connections, 27 private landowners with specific interactions and site visits, and getting a better idea of what it is they're trying to accomplish, and helping to steer them in the direction to better understand more information that might be incorporated into their considerations, or avenues to get them in touch with financial assistance capabilities. So I think that's all I had for the group. I'll kick it back to folks to have, I think, a question and answer period.
Perfect. Thank you, Ryan. And again, thank you, Tom Doak. Let me just give Adam Dagno 1 minute, just in the interest of time, to make any comments that you'd like, Adam, on the consolidated information that you have on existing or completed forest conservation carbon programs.
Sure. Thanks, Jody. So just following up quickly from discussions that we had in the first meeting where we talked about sort of there have been some projects put in place in Maine, right? But we sort of were seeking more additional information on what types of projects they were and sort of what the potential carbon sequestration could be done, or some other sort of equivalent metric, right? Recognizing that not everyone thinks in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent like myself. So what I did do is just put in the chat, I basically, with the help of a student, we've sort of started compiling a list of the different projects within Maine that are on the various carbon registries. And thanks also to Mark Berry, he's been helping me sort of better understand what these registries are actually showing. But there we've at least gone through some of the project plans and sort of assessed to what degree these different forest management options are being sort of discussed or implemented. So the spreadsheet itself is open for everyone. I think that link, I've allowed anyone who has the link and can access and view it. Just able to look at sort of what these different projects are, but sort of in a very quick summary, there's roughly 8 to 9 million total million tons of carbon dioxide that's sort of registered. The mix of projects are roughly about, at least those are recorded, about half the projects, but close to 500,000 of the acres are what we call some sort of active management, where the target is to actually increase yields, but also use what the increased yields are as a way to sort of supplement revenue and not necessarily change harvesting a bit, but not eliminate harvesting. The next sort of largest category is what we call passive management, and that's roughly about 20 to 25% of the acreage. Where that's focused on the idea that we had to increase rotations, reducing harvest relative to, again, whatever the sort of business as usual case is, right? And so, and then there's a few other like research forests and things like that who are also sort of doing some management on site that doesn't necessarily fit into those two categories. But anyway, the information's out there. We're going to continue to refine it. Any input that people have in terms of looking through it, please let me know. But it's at least one more resource that we can look at just to see what's actually being sort of currently done or really proposed to be done. Because a lot of these programs, you say that this is what you're going to do, but you ultimately then have the next 30, 40 to 99 years to actually carry out what you proposed in your application. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Adam. So I see us as having sort of between now and 11:30 to react to any of the three presenters, think about takeaways from those presentations, but also then kind of morph into all of the other materials that you've received by way of the meeting material packet. So let me just open it up and start getting reactions to the presentations. Go ahead, Karen.
Really a question, Tom, for you. I don't know if there's more detail or nuances that you might provide to the two responses of the woodland owners to expressing concern about property taxes, and if you know whether they're already in a program and still have concerns, or if it's just sort of generalized, and also the government regulation, if there's any more detail on those. Thanks.
I think we can look into the data, see if there's any more detail behind that. I think it's probably more is just, do you have a concern there? I mean, but those are concerns that we hear very commonly. I think the trigger of concern I hear is the people that are in it and worried about being trapped in it with some change. That's the biggest issue, I would say. But I think a lot of those concerns are of tax issues are people that aren't in a current use taxation program and are paying, forest land's it's taxed pretty expensive, pretty highly, frankly, now. So I think that's it. And then I think the government, the government intervention issue is a long-standing concern of just the unknown. It's usually not as bad as people think, but they think that's that's one of the things they continually worry about for sure. But I don't know if there's any more detail behind it, specific kind of things.
Other comments?
Hey, Tom, it's Dana. I have a couple of kind of probing questions on some of that data. So I don't want to make you bring it back up, but there was a slide that you had towards the end of your presentation that portrayed, I think it was the numbers of landowners who owned 50% or more, or excuse me, 50 acres or more.
Yeah.
And it said something like 89% cared about keeping the forest forested. And I was wondering if you probed into that any more to determine, one, how many are in some type of a current use taxation program so that they are committed to keeping that forest forested. And I guess the reason I'm asking the question, kind of a second, maybe it's a comment, not necessarily a question, is, are we focusing on the right group of keeping folks, keeping their land forested? And I just say that not tongue in cheek, but if that group is such a large group with such large acreage and they're already worried about keeping their forest forested, should we be paying more attention to the smaller acreage and folks who are in that 10 or 11% that aren't necessarily worried about keeping their land forested? So I've got two. One is more of a probing on data, and the other is just a kind of inquiry.
Well, one of the things I didn't talk about was people were asked whether you were a participant in a property tax program, and 26% said yes. So 75% are saying they're not. They're not. And then, the other part of it, of course, with the tree growth, there's no guarantee that those landowners are going to stay in the program.
Mm-hmm.
They can get out, and certainly they can sell off lots, which is more, it's more typical that instead of taking the entire tract out, they simply sell lots off or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there's still the vast majority of people are not in a current use taxation program. So I think Dana, there's still a big chunk of those people out there that I can only tell you I own 137 acres of land. So, and I'm not in current use taxation program. So I don't know, maybe I'm not typical of the person with 50 acres or more, but I think there's a lot of issues around that for a lot of people.
Okay. I appreciate that. I was just trying to kind of probe on, folks that obviously have an incentive to keep their land forested. So is creating a carbon program going to be almost a double dip? And should we really try to, and again, I'm not promoting this, I'm just saying for conversation, is it worth trying to focus on one group that isn't either getting some type of assistance through a current use or other, so we can focus on one group that will really, we know that they are at risk of selling off lots, developing, et cetera, and not keeping their land forested?
You have any reaction to that, Tom?
Well, I think there's real value. I think one of the reasons that we have as much land as we have in, keeps as forest land, certainly in the southern part of the state, are the current use taxation programs. And my sense is that those acreage are going to be more than you're ever going to get in a carbon program, to be honest with you. So I think there's real value in looking at I'm a big proponent of looking at the open space law, for example, because I think there's an opportunity there for getting a lot more people in. But again, there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee if you're in a current taxation program that you're going to stay. And so I don't think it's a double dip necessarily, because I think you're gonna see some actually changes of management potentially if you're in one of those programs to with a focus towards sequestering carbon if you enroll in a carbon program, which you wouldn't have to do if you're in current use taxation.
Thanks, Tom. Abello, and then Karen.
Thanks, Billy. And thanks, Tom and Ryan. Those were great slides. I think, the 89% figure, I think it gives us a sense that there's a lot of interest there and a lot of opportunity as we think about what are the incentives focus on that 89%, I think that's where we'll get the biggest bang for the buck. I would agree with Tom that the tree growth program has probably done more for conservation in the southern and central part of the state than just about anything outside of the sort of traditional LMF type programs. And so I'm wondering too about the 60% figure. The 60% of the land owners are 65 and older. So you have that cohort, and then 89%, I assume, of those are interested in some legacy or keeping their forest intact. So it feels to me like that's the target audience more so than folks that are, at least at this point, uninterested in managing their property.
Karen and then Melissa, and then I'm wondering, Tom Gordon, sorry, before you start, Karen, whether it may be useful to pull back up Tom Doak's slide deck to just make sure that we're looking at a couple of those figures accurately. Up to you, Tom Doak, but when I was taking notes, my understanding of that 89 or 90% figure, and maybe there were two different 89% or 90%, and I'm getting them confused. But my recollection was that there were 27% that had a management plan. 90% of those had actually done something.
Right.
And so the argument was that a management plan kind of promotes doing. It doesn't mean that, but if only 27% of a management plan, then 73% don't. And where should the focus of those be? So sorry, I didn't mean to insert.
And the 89% has to do with the number of family owners that say they want to keep their land as forested land, regardless of whether a plan or not. But that's their interest, which
right.
My point was, we're starting at a very high, we're not trying to convince people to keep their land as forested land and growing trees and sequestering carbon, the opportunity there that it presents, we're not trying to convince people this is a good thing. They already want to do those things, keep that as forested land. Now, how do we help those people do that and maybe enhance their lands? That's where the real opportunities are, I think.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry. Karen, then Melissa.
No, that was good. And actually my comment follows Tom Abello's, which is, I was, just looking at the age distribution and the older owners of these woodlands. And actually, Amanda, I'm thinking a bit of you in your past work with farmers, and thinking about, are there surveys or of any kind? And Tom Doak, you may just know this from your work, but that could get at, like, are there plans for how to move the forest land into the next generation? What kind of incentive would be helpful there? It's different, obviously, than farmland. You don't have necessarily apprentices that might take over the farm, but are there some strategies here that from other areas that could be applied as we're thinking about carbon programs that might be that bridge to the next generation? And I'll just say one more word. One thing that seemed really a potential benefit, if there are carbon programs that have any duration, say 20 years, 30 years, some kind of management agreement or practice agreement, that could bridge to the next generation. And so, I'm just playing with all these ideas.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Melissa, go ahead.
I always wanted to say to Tom that was very interesting. I kind of chuckled about the 4% of land being owned by those 45 and under, and I just squeaked into that category. And we have almost 300 acres, and none of them are in any kind of tax program. So we pay, full taxes on those. But the comment I had about the management plans, and because I've been involved, for over 10 years, and I've spoken to a lot of other landowners, young and old, there's a lot of misnomers about participating in those programs. One that I hear a lot is that landowners think that they have to open up their property to the public to participate in those plans. I think they confuse that with open space, and that that education about forest management plans might help, seeing as though 90% of people that have management plans, 90% do something with the plan. So maybe a little bit more education about how those plans operate would be helpful.
Great.
I think some of that confusion about access is the bills that keep coming up require public access if you're in one of the programs. So I think that's part of it. One of the real keys, I think management plans are part of, I've for a long time believed that management plans are too complicated for most landowners. They get it and they can't understand a lot of it, frankly. Our profession isn't very good sometimes at explaining, here's how to use it. But anything that can connect that landowner to that property and get them engaged is really valuable. And a plan is really something useful because they can go back and look at it and things like that. But anything that gets them interested. I was on a call earlier this week with a 4 Maine project where we're looking at helping landlords become more active in their management. And actually, I guess it was one of our chapter meetings, and some of our chapter leaders was talking about there are a lot of these newer owners are afraid to go out in the woods. They won't go, and they want somebody to come visit with them so they can walk around in the woods so they won't get lost on their own land. And so so they're not even connected yet. So they haven't been even on they're not even on their property. They're not connected to it yet. So how do we get people, once you get them connected and have an emotional attachment, you can't pry that land from those people. That's what we've learned.
Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to what Karen was raising about, the parallels, or what are there things that we can look at with the way that farmland is, folks are trying to make sure that the land use isn't changing. And I think probably the greatest parallel is just around, or where the focus is really on that, is around succession planning, because that's when land use is most likely to happen, or land use change is most likely to happen. And so there has been, there's a growing interest in and growing effort to be making sure that farmers have succession plans. And I think the other thing I would just say is that I think we all know this, that a lot of farmers have woodlots and they don't actively manage them. They're more focused on their cropland and their pasture land. And I think that's someplace where there could be a lot of gains as well.
Great.
We put together a guide for legacy planning with worksheets and everything, and it's been a pretty popular document for us that we give to people. But we've also done some research on a lot of these landowners that are current owners have a wish what will happen to their land, but they have not yet conveyed that wish to the people that might be receiving it, if there's an inheritance issue, or the people that are inheriting it, we did some work, aren't on board with what the people that are going to be leaving it to them are. So there's some real challenges around legacy planning and woodland owners.
Mm-hmm. Other reactions to the presentations? Go ahead, Mark.
Just picking up on that theme about the concerns over transition. I've thought for a long time that it's important that we look for opportunities to attract new forest landowners. And I think that goes beyond working with the current forest landowners to strategies that make forest ownership look attractive to a new generation and new types of owners that will be interested in keeping forest as forest and benefiting the climate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Jody, one thing I wanted to it's kind of following up on what Karen said about bridging that change in the ownership, and kind of relates to what we've been talking about, is I think the current use taxation programs also, while they're not a guarantee, they also help bridge because it runs with the land. So, I would say that an effective open space program, tree growth doesn't work for a lot of these owners, but an effective open space program could also provide that bridge into the, because it goes with the land. So it's going to create some bridge that may give people a chance to at least figure out what they want to do. So I
Yeah.
think there's some real value there.
Yeah, so think on this, all of you, between now and the end of this meeting, as to what you think would be the best timing for bringing open space taxation program, bringing an overview into this conversation, and when you think the right timing is for a presentation on that. I think at the end of the last meeting, you all were thinking, well, you know, this is a little bit down the road, but the more I've thought about it and just what's been brought up today, I am wondering whether sooner rather than later might be helpful to have a presentation on that. So just I'll circle back to that at the end of the meeting. So there are a number of possible directions we could take right now. One is to sort of go back to the meeting materials, make sure that any sort of aha or surprise or just interesting insights that you took from that material are articulated, identified, so that others hear it and we can think about pulling that forward to the next meeting. So that's one option, just to make sure that we don't overlook that body of information. The other is to, you know, in the next 23 minutes, and maybe we could do both of these things, is to kind of hear from each of you, to the extent that you're comfortable in sharing this, as to what did you take away from all this? Like, if there was one thing that you learned from all this, you would want to make sure that we focused on those older landowners. You'd want to make sure that we focused on, you know, 50 acres and over, because that's where the body of the acreage is. I just want to make sure that those nuggets of, we got to make sure we include this in our thinking as we move forward, that we get those down. So do those approaches make sense for the next 20 minutes, or what do you think of that? Yeah, okay. I'm seeing some
Hey,
now.
Jody, can I
Please.
think that's absolutely fine. I actually like that perspective. I do have one more question for
Please.
Tom, but I don't have to ask it now. I can ask it later.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. And it might be to Adam too. So I'm just looking at the data that Adam put together. So this is for both maybe Tom and Adam. Adam, the data you sent and the survey you did, it looks like there's pretty good information as to what, you know, how many folks in your survey use management plans, who didn't, those who use foresters, who didn't when they harvested wood. So Tom, and maybe it's just not in what you presented, have you gotten into that question? I asked it in the last meeting, you know, why landowners are not using services of a forester for management, for either a management plan or during a harvest. Do you have those responses? Because I think it's helpful as we go through this process to just have this background, and maybe this isn't the time, but I just wanted to ask the question.
You know, I think there's some real good, and actually, I think the Forest Service might actually have some data on this, but I think there's some pretty good evidence that many of these landowners think it's a cost to them. They have, you know, some help, that the return doesn't match the cost, rightly or wrongly. I don't think, and I think there's evidence that shows that that's incorrect, but that's a widely held perception, I would say, and then I think on the management plan side, if you look at the numbers on cost share, you know, in a lot of management plans, a lot of cost sharing in management plans, but the number of people that understand cost share is incredibly small. So I think part of it is people don't know the assistance is available, and then they think it's an expense. You know, a net cost to them.
Yep.
No, in fact, it probably isn't. I'm guessing, I'm pretty sure that that's where they're at.
Yep.
Okay, good. All right, well, if you then turn to your meeting materials, maybe looking at pages 5 through 7 first, and that's the summary that Sally Stockwell at Maine Audubon put together with some input from Andy Schultz from the Maine Forest Service and Amanda Mahaffey from the Forest Stewards Guild. You know, this, I think, aligns with information that Tom provided in his slide deck about that wildlife interest, also Ryan's, that wildlife interests really sort of lead landowners' interests and is a really effective hook. But anything that you took away from that, or from pages 8 through 23, the tables, some of which Tom summarized in his, many of which Tom summarized in his presentation. Thoughts on any of that?
So Jody,
Mhm.
this is Alec.
Go ahead.
You want a big picture sort of overview reaction to all of this? And of course, I've been exposed to a lot of this for a long time, but sort of the take home for me is most landowners care and they're motivated. They want to do good things for their land and for the forest more generally, but they're not well informed. And this won't come as news to anybody. We haven't done a very good job in connecting with them and getting them to understand the opportunities that are created by the cost share programs, the tax programs, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, this is not to fault anybody's efforts up to this point, but we need to think about new models for how we can really be effective in reaching people. And I think that things like the Forestry for Maine Birds, where you're appealing to a particular interest that all of those pages show that they care about, and providing kind of one-on-one outreach to people is something that probably in the overall scheme of things is going to be very effective.
Great. Other comments of a similar nature, I would put that at 30, sort of the 30,000 foot level, which is, it's not a criticism at all. I think that's where you need to start. So any thoughts at that level or at another level of specificity that can help guide you? Go ahead, Melissa.
Well, just to sort of reiterate what Alec was saying, when I joined and got my first forest management plan, I had to ask 100 questions and go to a couple different offices, and I wasn't really sure what I was even asking for or who was paying for it, and it took a lot of research to find that out, and I was actively interested. So for your casual landowner who has love for the outdoors, I don't know that they're going to jump through all those hoops like I did. And eventually, it ended up being Patty Cormier who, said, "Oh, you know what you should do? You should do this." And that was through a casual conversation. So I don't think it's super easy to figure that out as a regular landowner.
Tom, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with Melissa and Alec, and would just add that, in the Natural Working Lands work group, we talked a lot about technical assistance for landowners and giving more resources to the Forest Service to do this kind of outreach. And I think, it's it feels like it's more pressing than ever. And I don't recall offhand how many positions that we were envisioning, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 10, 8 to 10. And so I think that's a really key piece of this. And then some of the information coming out in the survey, only 27% of landowners are enrolled in some form of current use taxation program. The benefit, especially on the tree growth side, those are significant benefits. 95% reduction on the property tax bill. The landowners, I think a better job of communicating those benefits, I think would help a lot as well. Obviously there's some loose handcuffs associated with that, but I think those benefits long-term should be enough to get more people involved.
That's great. Go ahead, Karen.
Well, the takeaway here is I did not realize how many of the smaller landowner group were not involved in participating in tree growth, or and that, so I'm just sort of thinking about that. And that seems to be something we be thinking about as we move forward. And I'm also thinking about the encouragement from Patty Cormier through, I forget which speaker transmitted it. I guess it was Ryan, to be the hook. And so certainly from the Audubon materials, the hook is birds, and bird friendly is climate friendly, according to the materials. But I think as we proceed as a task force, being, mindful of the hook, is it carbon? Is it everything else? Is it just, layering all these things? And then the third point is I'm just struck by how there are programs out there, but I think there's something isn't penetrating, it seems, to the landowner group, and how could that change? So those are the big three things that I'm pondering now.
Great, that's great. Dana, go ahead, and then Stacy.
Great, thank you. So comment I would make, and it kind of keys off of what Alec said. So I think we've got to look at, what have we been doing for 30 or 40 years, and something is not resonating. And so I'm not going to be the wet blanket here, but I'm going to try to provide a pragmatic point of view. Endless amounts of money and throwing money to doing the same thing over and over again is not going to get us there. And I'm not saying this in any way to be disparaging of what Tom just mentioned during our working lands group, Tom Abello. But we've tried to do this for a long time, and we're not. The needle's moving, but it's probably not moving enough. So I think we've got to look at outside the box, and that's where I want to key on what Alex said. I'm looking at that data on pages 8 forward, and I don't know if this was from Tom's survey or Adam, you did. It doesn't matter. But you have touch points along the way. And I will say that just looking at page 11, or excuse me, page 12, where you've got the influence of the logging community, and obviously I represent them, so I'm partial. But you have a touch point of the logging community that I think is an untapped resource that can help with this process, because 50% of land, or maybe 55%, are using foresters, 45% aren't. But you've got a touch point. I think we've got to get all hands on deck of who can influence this, and we've got to think outside the box, because doing the same thing over and over again is not going to get us there. So,
thank you. Yep. Stacy, go ahead.
So I'm a data geek, and looking at this survey in preparation for this meeting, I was wowed by how much data there is there, how much we do know about these people, which is great. They've told us how they want to receive this information, which is wonderful. I don't know if I can find that table, but they've told us whether they want it in written form, or if they want to talk to an expert, or if they want a site visit. Frankly, I was really alarmed by the age of the owners, and my concern is what happens when they're not here anymore, and what happens with that transfer of land, which you guys have talked about, which has been great. But my question remains, what is their holdup? So say you have somebody that has land, and they might not have that land in 30 years for whatever reason. Are they concerned that entering into a program will lock that land up, and they don't want it locked for the next generation? Or do they want it locked to ensure it remains forested? So you guys might have a better feel for that, but I imagine people fall into one camp or another. And is it more one or the other, or is it an even split? Because I think we can cater to that. As Mark was saying, we need to make this attractive. And so what is attractive to those people, and how can we kind of market it that way? I think that will be helpful. The other big takeaway I'm getting is that this is complicated, man. It is not easy. And as Melissa was saying, and she was interested, that she really had to do a lot of work to figure it out. We're not going to get people's buy-in if it's that hard to figure out. This is not their job. This is a piece of land they like to enjoy. For a lot of those people, it seems like they're retired and maybe they do have a little bit of time to figure that out. Looking at the education levels, these are smart people. So it has to be really complicated, where they just kind of decided this was too much of a hassle, I'm not going to do it. So we need to make it easy. We have to have those resources out there that are quick, and people can get a general idea of which direction they want to go. And we have to give the perception that this can be done with very little effort. Otherwise, people are just, they're not going to care enough to make the effort, and we need them to do that. So
Thank you.
my takeaway.
Yeah, that's great. Melissa, and then Mark.
Just kind of building off of what Dana had mentioned about forestry professionals, I'm wondering if some kind of mentor program might help for people that are interested in becoming or getting a forest management plan. You know, somebody like a forester or a logging professional, or even somebody like me who has participated in the program for that long, could be that mentor to say, here's step one, here's step two, you know, do you want some help with this? You know, and just offer that sort of consulting maybe on that level.
Great. Mark.
Thanks. I think for my 30,000 foot level, and you know, like Alec and like many of us, a lot of this material is not new, but it is very helpful to use it to frame our understanding of what's happening now as we try to think about the outcomes that we want. And one of the things that really emerges more strongly than anything else when we look at the current landowners are their motivations, you know, what they care about and why they own forest land. And, you know, clearly it's not to produce commercial forest products for these smaller landowners. That's far down the list. And so when we say it's, you know, a low percentage of them that are in tree growth, that's not surprising, because when you sign up for tree growth, you sign something that says your primary purpose is to produce forest products. And a lot of people will sign that, you know, even if it's not their true primary motivation, because they intend to produce forest products. But I think that is one of the reasons why it makes sense for us to be looking at the open space program as a potential opportunity to provide a benefit that will help with the goal of keeping forest as forest for people for whom the tree growth program isn't the right fit and isn't likely to become the right fit. So, you know, that's another vote for the opportunity that the open space program represents. And when we do get to looking at it, I think we'll have to do so in a way that is very aware of where the burden of that tax savings falls, and that it not, you know, become an impact primarily on our local communities. But big picture for me is around keeping forest as forest. And I think what we're not seeing in this data set is we're not seeing the lands that are being subdivided, the lands that are being sold for other purposes. You know, we're not capturing where the opportunities were and what it might have taken to get a different outcome, you know, where we're losing forest land today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. I think it was Tom and then Ivan.
Well, I was just going to say, I think we're going to have to retrain the forestry professionals in the state about how to talk to the landowners based on the information we have. I think we've been using the same kind of a lot of the same approaches and the same language, and those don't necessarily work, I think. And so that's one of the things. And in response to the question about why, I think there are a couple of different owners. There are a lot of owners that want to keep their land as forested, but they also want to have options for that land going forward if it's going to somebody else. We have a land trust program that we've now owned about 8,000 acres all gifted to us. And these are the people that do that are people that either their heirs don't want it or they don't trust their heirs. Those are the people that we get. The rest of those folks that we deal with are trying to figure out a way to, they don't want a permanent restriction. They have a hope that it continues as woodland, but they're not willing to put some kind of permanent thing stuck to it. And as they would say, manage from the grave. So you've got two different kind of approaches about people that may have the same interest in keeping it as woodland, but they see it from two different points of view.
Yeah, Ivan.
Yeah, so I would rather hear earlier rather than later more about open space. First of all, Jody, to your question.
Yeah.
And to Mark's comment, I just want to sort of emphasize that the two pieces of information I've been a lot of great information, a lot of sort of reinforcement of things that if we've looked at forestry data for Maine, we have a sense of. One is and Adam asked this at the top of the hour, what's the stocking on the different land? There's two things we're trying to talk about here. One, preserving forest land. The other is increasing carbon sequestration. If they're fully stocked, then we're preserving what we have, but we're not sequestering more. If they're not fully stocked, then we're doing both. And that may be the same dialogue or it may be different. Going back to Mark, however, I've been wondering, we're losing 10,000 acres a year. Where's that coming from? Is it whole ownerships being sold off? Is it, nibbling away at the larger ownerships? And what's the carbon tag that goes with those losses? I don't know whether we have those data kind of going forward, but it would be good to look at it sort of through the carbon loss vulnerability lens as well as the forest loss vulnerability lens. So that's it.
So does anybody want to respond to that? I'm wondering about Adam or Tom or Mark, others, Alec, that knows whether there's the ability to analyze that. You've got this chunk of landowners that who are getting on in age, some assessment of where the land with the greatest sequestration, further sequestration potential is, and is there any, can you make a Venn diagram? Do we have any of that information? Alec, go ahead.
Short answer is yes. On the conversion side, there's two efforts underway. Highstead is down in Massachusetts is working on coming up with numbers for that, as well as improved forest management and some other things, building, et cetera, et cetera. But that's being worked on. Also, NEF has done some work on that and come up with numbers for New England in that regard. And as regards the opportunity for carbon storage by increasing stocking, we've done work on that issue as well, and come to the conclusion that the opportunity represented by increased stocking is in the order of 500 million metric tons CO2e, which is equivalent to taking every car on the road in Maine off the road for over a century. So the opportunities are huge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we can share that information with you if you wish.
Okay, great. Any last thoughts from any of you before we pivot to public comment? Reactions to materials and presentations, kind of big takeaways. Go ahead, Adam.
I think I just want to put in my 2 cents because it's great that I think what we're struggling with the 30,000 foot and then the specific policies. And I personally think I don't want to get too distracted with just looking at open space or just looking at mechanisms, which is kind of getting at what Dana was pointing out a little bit. I really think we want to try to get our head around about, I guess, building a little bit off of what Ivan said is, what is our real objective before we start talking too much about instruments to achieve that objective? So I'm just kind of throwing that out there from a policy perspective. We can easily go down a lot of rabbit holes with specific approaches that may or may not get us to our objective. And if we don't know what our objective is before we do that, it can get us off track.
Karen, yep, thank you, Adam.
Yeah, I think that was well put. And, you know, sort of quoting from Mark, you know, is it keeping Maine's forests and doing whatever we can to keep, you know, landowners that have forests that are less than 5,000 acres to hold on to that, because that is important for carbon storage and sequestration? Or are we really going to also overlay that with this added goal of more carbon sequestration? So I appreciate that very much, and kind of keep that goal. What is our goal here in mind?
Right. Okay, well, that's great. Let's pivot briefly. Who has their hand up here? Tom. Okay, Tom, you go. Well, then we'll pivot to public comment.
I was just going to say, I think it's both, Karen. I don't think you can focus on just one of those. I think there are a lot of landowners. I believe there are a lot of landowners that aren't going to be in a carbon program of any kind, but they will. But so there's that group. But then there's also the group, or focus on carbon sequestration. But there's also a big chunk of those that if we can keep that land as forested land, they will be doing that. Whether that we count them as doing that or not, they will do that. But I think you have to have both. It's not going to be one or the other to have any real impact, I think.
Yeah, and I'm certainly, I guess, agreeing with you, because during the course of the discussion, I was like, oh, you've just got to focus everything on keeping that forest landowner holding that. And then, you know, but what about the carbon sequestration? So my question is really to remind us to figure out where we are in that, and to be mindful of what strategy we're talking about in relation to which part of the goals. Because I think there are strategies that could be more effective for one part of that than the other.
And the last, I guess I would add to that. The reason I brought up that 89% was that you already have those people willing to do this. So how do you keep those pieces? Then that's going to be I think that's going to be the real big piece of this. And now, okay, those that are interested in enhancing their land for carbon or getting in a carbon program, okay, how do we add that into it? But you already have all these people that are doing something. How do we keep them doing that? Because that's going to be really, and it's not a hard job because they already want to do it.
Right. Okay. All right. I'm calling that done briefly to see if we have any folks from the public who would like to comment. And if you just want to raise your hand, we'll get you. Who is this here? Jonathan Shears, go right ahead. Just take yourself off mute.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you guys for the presentation. I just wanted to speak up and share a little optimistic view on things here. So I work with the American Forest Foundation on our Family Forest Carbon Program, which so far we've just launched in Pennsylvania, where we're piloting it, and we're hoping to spread northeast soon within the next year. But we've actually found that carbon is a really good hook, kind of backing up some of the hypotheses that Tom, you named earlier. But we, out of like the almost 50 landowners we've seen enroll in our program in Pennsylvania, about half didn't even have a forest management plan before our program. So there's we're working both with landowners who have been actively managing and who have a relationship with a forester, but also a lot of new folks who we considered previously unengaged by the forestry community. So I think there's a ton of promise here, especially with how popular carbon is and how much it's in the news to attract that kind of new group of landowners into management.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. Thank you, Jonathan. Other comments from the public?
Have to do a, we'll have to do
Okay. All right. Well then, if there are, oh, actually, I'm gonna just gonna see. Doug, are you trying to make a comment?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm 75. I've owned several wood lots totaling 180 acres for 30 years. I'm under tree growth, and I'd like to tell you about some of the realities of it. First of all, unlike what someone said, the tax benefits are far less than a 95% reduction in taxes. Far less. The actual reduction in, at least in my area of southern Maine, is there's about a 3/5 reduction in taxes, which is substantial, but certainly not 95%. Also, not mentioned is the tax penalty for withdrawal is very, very substantial. And added to that is if you sell your lot, if I sell my lot when I'm 85, while it's still under tree growth, the selling price is much less because the new owner will be automatically under tree growth and will have to pay that penalty. In fact, will have to pay a higher penalty if he or she has to sell the land. That's a disincentive to purchase the land. Thirdly, you are required under the program to harvest, which is legit. It's part of the program. However, that may be a disincentive for some people. These are some factors in why more people don't enroll. Also, tree growth plans and updates have become very expensive. Recently, I had a 10-year update on a 40-acre lot. It cost $400. So I think that the committee ought to include someone who actually owns small woodlots under an open spaces program or the tree growth tax program in order to get firsthand knowledge about what it's actually like. I could not have bought and enjoyed and produced good timber on my lot if it were not for tree growth. But you want to be sure about what the implications actually are. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Doug. Okay, anyone else from the public who wants to weigh in? All right, then, you know, what I put down on the agenda is sort of a review of the executive order again. If you go to page 3 of the meeting materials, I think it's just useful to see that as a guide, as a reminder of what ultimately needs to be both done and then produced. And I think that you are well on your way to working toward many of those items. With those in mind, I just would like your thoughts on the next layer of information that you feel like you need. If you'll recall from my cover email associated with the meeting materials from a week ago, the logic of focusing on landowner perceptions, interests, motivations, concerns, was that seemed to be more logical to focus on that prior to getting into the specifics of the actual practices that could be encouraged to be implemented because they help to sequester more carbon. So, you know, prior to this meeting, my thought was, well, let's make sure that the April meeting, we provide you with information about practices that are being employed already, but not to go that next step beyond that of looking into the actual mechanisms, the actual programs, having somebody like Jonathan, if you're still on the line here, from the AFF program or from LTA or from
ZA, short for pizza.
Could whoever is, Doug, if you could put yourself on mute, I'll just mute you right now. Okay. So that was sort of my thinking of the logical progression, but I'd like to hear from all of you as to what you think would be most useful to move to from here. Information and presentation or presentations. Karen.
Well, I see that Adam had put in the chat the question about where are we with task B? And that somewhat goes to, I think, Alec, your willingness to share some information and data about the potential for more carbon stocking on this category of woodland owners. But in my mind, in addition to that, I think this consideration of practices would be timely.
Dawn Mancius, could you speak to that item B in the executive order, reviewing current harvest levels and carbon stocking data on woodland owners of 10 to 10,000 acres? I know you've been working on that.
Sure. We've got our biometrician and our data person. They started to take an initial view at how we might get at the data regarding particularly the harvest levels. We don't collect the data in exactly the format that's being looked for, so it would be kind of an approximation. And we're also going to be reaching out to folks at Maine and the Forest Service shortly to try to pull together various data sources to come up with an estimate for the group.
Is that something that could be available for the next meeting, which would mean a week before the next meeting?
It's going to be a very, at that point, it would be a very preliminary estimate with pretty wide error bars around it. A little bit better than a cocktail napkin estimate, but.
Okay, let's come back to you in a moment. Tom Doak, and then I just want to circle back to Alec, just so that I'm clear on what information you have in that regard. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, when the Working Lands Group was meeting and developing this, there weren't a lot of options available for landowners. The world is changing pretty quickly here now, and I don't know what the timing is, but I think it's going to be useful at some point to hear of the different efforts, because there are multiple efforts underway around the country that would potentially be available to Maine smaller woodland owners to participate in carbon markets that are being rapidly developed. So I think it's useful at some point to understand what's going on in the rest of the world. And the AFF TNC one is one of them, but one of several actually. So I think that's going to be useful. And then I do think some discussion around what practices might enhance carbon sequestration, and then the opportunity potentially for cost share programs that would offset some of those expenses would be really valuable for us to get to. So those two, I don't know what the timing of those two are, but I think those are two important pieces that we need to have discussions about as this group.
Yeah. Tom and Mark.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then specifically, what are the practices that a landowner has to do on the ground? You know, what from soup to nuts, what are they required to do as part of that? Because what I read from those programs is very sort of 30,000 foot, but in terms of the actions that a landowner needs to take, I think would be helpful. And also the NRCS cost share programs, it would be good to get a little bit more detail on some of the things that they offer.
Mhm. Great. Mark, go ahead.
I was just going to share my perspective. Appreciate Adam asking the question about the data task, and Don, that some of that work's underway. I guess my sense is it isn't urgent that this group have the result of that at our next meeting. I think we have a really strong sort of fundamental understanding that the opportunity is real and huge. And so, well, we need that data at the end of this process as part of a report and as part of a case that we may make to the administration or the legislature. I don't think we need it to continue the work of evaluating practices and other approaches that we may take to look for improvement. So I'd rather see us do a good job with that data than rush to have it done in 2 weeks.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's helpful. Dana.
I believe probably it's already on the table, but an overview of open space and having someone present to us on the open space program, its particulars, so that we all have a better understanding of how it works, I think would be certainly appropriate for a future meeting. April is no better time than the present. And maybe not for April, but Tom had mentioned in his presentation, the demand of any carbon program to have some type of third-party certification. And I know FSC, I'll just put on the table, I've been involved with a global group that's working with FSC on smallholder participation, because the biggest challenge for smallholders, small landowners to participate, even in, not mention carbon markets, but green certification, third-party certification, is cost. If they harvest their land every 20, 30, or 40 years, they're not going to spend money on participating in those programs. They're just too expensive if it's a one-off every 40 years. So there has to be a better way to get them incorporated into those programs. And so if it helps, I could bring some resources to bear on FSC's new smallholder program that they've just rolled out. It just actually got rolled out this year. So happy to bring that to the table if helpful, not for April, but for the future.
Okay, great. Alec, let me just put you on the spot again, because I can listen to the tape again just to understand better these sources of information that you had. But could you just offer up again what you described earlier that you think you could provide that would be helpful to the group at this point?
Okay, so first of all, I mentioned Highstead.
Yeah.
They're working on a report now. I don't have access. I can't give that to you, but they're working on completing a report on a number of these topics that my understanding is that it should be done shortly.
Yeah, I think what I was asking for was something more specific than a number of these topics. What specifically is it about?
They're covering, among other things, things like avoided conversion, the losses from conversion. Mm-hmm. They're estimating what could be done in terms of improved forest management and increasing stocking. They're also, as I recall, looking at if we did more building with wood, what would the benefit of that be? So it's those kinds of things. There's a bunch of other things as well.
Okay.
And the person to speak to on that is Spencer Meyer at Highstead. Okay, so that's what they're doing. All right, in terms of what we have done up to this point, we've looked county by county for all of New England as to what the stocking levels are and what they could be. So we have that information available, can make it available to you. We've also done, independently of Highstead, a calculation of what the conversion losses are in terms of carbon. We've also looked at how much more carbon could be stored if we increase building with wood. So there's some significant overlap with what Highstead has done, but those are the things that we've done. Be happy to share with you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So can I just see a show of hands around timing for a presentation on the open space program? Those who think that April would be a good idea as opposed to later, I guess is the point. Right, I'm seeing most of you. Adam thinks no. Anybody else think no? Too early? Okay, then I think we're gonna go with yes, and we'll figure out. And any thoughts on who would be best equipped, or multiples, who would be best equipped to do that?
Jody,
Yeah.
I think it would be important to reach out to Maine Municipal and the Maine Association of Assessing Officers at this point.
Mm-hmm. To make the presentation, or to make sure that their input is added to a presentation?
I don't know if their willingness to make presentation, but they certainly would have perspectives to offer.
Yeah, for sure. Karen, go ahead.
Would you also be having some presentation on the practices?
Yeah,
Okay, because I would think we need to have that in the next meeting somehow.
Yeah, I was hearing that as well, and so I was going to go there next, but I just wanted to make sure that if any of you were aware of who you thought would be the best lead presenter on the open space current use taxation program, that I hear that from you. Any other thoughts?
I mean, possibly somebody from Revenue Services.
And not to volunteer Tom Doak, but I know he knows that program well in terms of the different pieces of the enrollment. So Tom, maybe you could walk the group through that. And Don, you know that program pretty well too. So
I could do it. I could certainly do it, but I don't know that you want to hear from me 2 times in a row. So I'm happy to do it.
I just want to hear from you, Tom. Okay.
I think Maine Revenue Service, someone there should be at least reached out to. Follow Don's suggestion.
Okay.
I just shared a presentation from a couple years ago in the chat. I'm not sure who actually gave it, but that might be
awesome.
An option.
Okay. All right. And then lastly, sorry, Don, Maine Association of who? Don,
Maine Association of Assessing Officers.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you. All right.
Jody, can I say one more thing about it? I think it's important to sort of talk about the program itself and what it does and the different steps that a landowner can choose. And then there's a separate portion, same presentation, but another portion where we talk about from Maine Revenue's perspective, maybe the MMA perspective as well. But I think there's the attributes, and then there's the other kind of financial mechanisms. But to me, they're a little bit separate.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. All right, then on the practices, thoughts on presenters or information. Whoops, somebody wants to come in the meeting. I feel like from the last meeting, we sort of have a laundry list of mechanisms, entities, nonprofits that are initiating programs. So that seems more obvious to me for May as to who we might ask to present on mechanisms. I'm not clear on practices. Any thoughts on that?
I think it depends to some extent whether you or we as a group want to hear about the practices that are incorporated into specific existing programs, or whether the emphasis is on the full range of possible practices that could both benefit the climate from Maine forests and help us keep that opportunity available by keeping more forest on the landscape. So is it the full range of possible practices, or is it the practices that have been selected by the programs that are existing now or under development?
I'm guessing you have an opinion on that, Mark. Do you?
Well, the second one is easier. But the first one, could perhaps be more logical.
I agree.
Karen, did you have something?
Well, I guess I understood, and perhaps those of you that have been more connected to Manomet, there's been some very ongoing and thoughtful consideration of this topic. It would seem that there have been efforts to delve into this. So I'd like to do a little thinking about this, Jody, and I'll send you an email if I have suggestions. But I think to maybe not try to get absolutely every perfect type of management, but a good collection of them so that folks have a sense of what is being used and what's on short lists would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the point, and then I'll take you next, Alec. You've got obviously the programs that have been implemented. There's been some thought and logic behind why they've chosen the practices that they have. So they've gone through some kind of an exercise that you now are going to have to go through yourself on what sort of program to create. So I think understanding that process that those organizations went through to hone in on the practices that they did would be helpful. But it does seem to be that you would be limiting yourself unnecessarily to start there and not cast a somewhat wider net. Alec, go ahead.
Okay, so Karen mentioned the effort that's underway with John Hagan, no longer at Manomet, but used to be with Manomet, is heading up, which is now called the Focal Project, FCCL, Forest Carbon for Commercial Landowners. And as part of that effort, we've put together, and Adam knows this well because he's been deeply involved with it, as has Mark. We've put together a work plan for the research that we think needs to get accomplished within the next year to inform policy decisions. And part of that is focused on what are the practices and combined practices, silvicultural systems, if you will, that could be used to simultaneously increase carbon stocking on the land and also maintain harvest. And Laura Kenefek at the university and US Forest Service is going to be leading the charge on that effort to put together not only a list of the practices in silvicultural systems, but also the scientific rationale, the studies that have been done that lie behind why they were selected.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well then I will likely circle back to you, Alec, and Adam, and to better understand that work and if there's anything that we could pull on early. Is it too early to make a recommendation? Okay, so any other thoughts on sources of information on practices? And then I'm going to let you all go. Okay. All right. Well, I think this is good. I am likely going to follow up with a few others of you to have one-on-one conversations. Karen, I'll wait for an email from you. And any last thoughts? Just a note that your next meeting is on Friday, April 2nd, same time of day, 10 to 12. You'll receive materials on March 26th, the week prior. And any final comments? All right. Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.
You too. Thank you.